Richard Easterlin was born in New Jersey in 1926. By 1945, he had earned a degree in mechanical engineering from Stevens Institute of Technology, but then shifted disciplines and completed a 1949 master's degree and a 1953 PhD in economics, both from the University of Pennsylvania. He then became an assistant professor in Penn's economic department for 3 years and then an associate professor for 4 more years, serving as chair of the department in 1959 and 1960. He then spent a year as a visiting professor at Stanford before returning as the William R. Kennan Professor of Economics at Penn until 1982. It was after his return from Stanford that he began to publish his most famous work on what has become known as Easterland cycles in the relation between population sizes of generations and economic trends. This article, co-authored with economist and legal scholar Michael Wachter and urban studies scholar Mary Wachter, appeared several years after Easterlin's earliest work on the links between economic and demographic cycles. It offers a reasonably compact picture of the theory. Some of Easterlin's other articles can be many times longer than this selection. His basic thesis about these cycles has generated an entire subfield of research for economists, demographers, and other scholars. Variety version of the demographic transition, with its 4 stages ending in low birth and death rates and resulting very slow population growth, doesn't have much to say about what might happen after a country finishes this process, always assuming that this turns out to be possible. But it isn't very plausible to think that the end of such a transition would be the end of history. Populations will continue to have interesting histories after passing through the demographic transition. New trends in death rates or birth rates could appear. This article by Richard Easterlin and a couple of his colleagues explores one aspect of such continuing population history, with a special emphasis on birth rates. It helps in coming to terms with this article to know that Richard Easterlin is an economist. He studied with another famous economist from the generation before his, Simon Kuznets. As a graduate student, Easterlin worked on a project in which Kuznets was compiling historical data on fluctuations in wages and prices, first from the United States and eventually from other countries as well. This large-scale research project turned up evidence for what eventually became known as Kuznets cycles in the economy. It turns out that incomes and prices tend to rise and fall in an ongoing series of pretty regular waves or cycles. Times of rising wages and prices eventually reach a peak of economic performance, but then the situation changes and the good times are replaced by deteriorating incomes, rising unemployment, and sometimes even falling prices, known as deflation. Eventually, the bad times also reach a low point, and the cycle begins again. Kuznets traced these 15 to 25-year cycles back all the way to the mid-1800s in the United States, suggesting that they began about the same time that the country began to transform itself from a rural agricultural economy to an increasingly urban population that was increasingly employed in non-agricultural manufacturing and service jobs. Kuznets and his students and colleagues wrote a lot of scholarly books and articles about the causes and consequences of these long swings in economic growth. Easterlin got particularly involved with a project in which his collaboration with Kuznets continued even after he completed his PhD at Penn and was teaching there as a junior member of the economics faculty. This project explored the connection between more conventional economic measures, like wages, prices, interest rates, and other things to do with money, and something that was to become Easterlin's lifelong preoccupation, the dynamics of population growth and change. In 1958, Kuznets published a paper with the title Long Swings in the Growth of Population and in Related Economic Variables. These ideas shaped Easterlin's thinking for decades to come. He published his own first paper on the subject only 3 years later in 1961. In the 1958 paper, Kuznets pioneered the idea that there were periodic swings in the rate of population growth, and that these fluctuations in population growth mirrored the economic swings in wages and prices that he had been tracking for years. We can see this in the bottom panel of Figure 7 from his article. The bars plotted across this bottom panel alternate consistently between values that are first above and then below 0. This does not mean that the population was alternately growing and shrinking in total size. These are changes in the growth rate of the population. For example, the first negative bar means that the population was growing about 10% slower during the decade from 1890 to 1900 than it had been between 1880 and 1890. The population never stopped growing larger, but that growth was slower than average for the negative bars and faster than average for the positive bars. Kuznets was impressed by how closely these slowdowns and speedups in population growth seemed to match with the long swings in wages and prices that he already had been charting, and wanted to understand why this was happening. This is why he decided to deconstruct the total growth rate of the population into its two main components, that is, natural increase, the difference between the birth rate and the death rate, and net migration, the difference between rates of immigration and emigration. When he did this, he discovered another interesting pattern. The middle panel in his figure 7 shows the share of the total change in growth rates that was due to a change in net migration. The top panel shows how much of the total change in growth rates was due instead to the surplus of births over deaths. Again, this does not show us the actual level of immigration or natural increase. The United States continued to experience rapid growth from both demographic sources throughout the period. But the middle panel of the figure shows us clearly that at least for the first 3 time periods, that is from 1880 through 1920, changes in net migration accounted for most of the slowdown or speed up of overall population growth. Natural increase continued to contribute to population growth throughout this period, but at a pretty constant rate, so this factor had almost nothing to do with fluctuations in the observed growth rate. Following Kuznets, Easterlin has a simple explanation for this dominance of the net migration component. During the periods of faster population growth, which corresponded to the economic boom times in wages, prices, and employment, immigrants flocked to America in increasing numbers to seek their fortunes. In those days, there was no Department of Homeland Security, no multi-year waiting periods for complicated visas, no real legal restrictions on immigration at all. If you could get here, the health inspectors would check you for terrible diseases or insanity and then usually pass you through, and you were on your way to life in America. The U.S. economy had a kind of demographic thermostat in operation. When the supply of workers started to get too low due to rapid economic expansion, the thermostat opened the gates and immigrants immediately flooded in and solved the problem. What Kuznets showed us is that the immigration response to good times accounted for nearly all of the fluctuation in population growth rates over time. The rate of natural increase, though positive and important, did not fluctuate in this way. Similarly, during times of economic recession, high unemployment, and perhaps even falling wages and prices, immigrants simply stopped showing up in the numbers seen previously. Some of them even turned around and went back to the old countries. This caused the total growth rate of the population to slow down, and again, this migration component accounted for nearly all of the change in growth rates. But then something happened. After the stock market crash of 1929 and the Great Depression, something changed in a very fundamental way in American society. By the last couple of time periods shown in Kuznets' figure 7, hardly any of the fluctuations in population growth could be explained by faster or slower net immigration. Instead, a new pattern emerges in which the largest share of change in overall population growth rates from one decade to the next is accounted for by changes in natural increase. For example, growth was a lot slower in the decade between 1930 and 1940 than it had been between 1920 and 1930. But most of this was the result of slower natural increase, not less net immigration, which played only a minor role. Now, natural increase is itself the difference between birth and death rates, so if natural increase gets smaller, this could be due to either more deaths or fewer births. In this case, as we'll see later, the main cause was fewer births happening during the Great Depression. Then between 1940 and 1950, the overall growth rate again climbed much higher compared to the previous decade. This time, the contribution of net immigration was even smaller, and the observed change was the result almost entirely of rising birth rates. This last bar in the figure is the start of a picture of the famous baby boom. But what happened between the 1920s and the 1930s? Why did net migration fade away out of the picture as a contributor to changes in population growth rates, to be replaced instead by the natural increase component, which had been all but invisible during earlier decades? This is the master question that motivated Easterlin's research over the next several decades, so we will explore his search for an answer next. Easterlin longed to come up with an answer to his first question. Why did net immigration fade out of the picture as an explanation for fluctuations in the overall growth rate of the U.S. population? Everybody knew the answer to that one. As a great wave of immigration poured into the United States in the last decades of the 1800s and the opening decades of the 1900s, its composition began to change. At the outset of the wave, most immigrants had been arriving from northwestern Europe, from countries like Germany, Norway, Sweden, England, France, and the other countries that had been experiencing their own demographic transitions. These population flows were part of the transition process in those countries, offering a migration escape valve for the rapid population growth that went along with the mid-transition gap between birth and death rates. But by the turn of the century, the stream of migrants from these countries began to dry up as they completed their transitions. New transitions began to stimulate migrants from other countries to travel to America. The arrivals gradually shifted over to people from Poland, Italy, Greece, and other places that the earlier Anglo-Saxon population found rather distasteful. Nativist sentiment began to increase. Popular demagogues rose to fame on a tide of ugly rhetoric about all those nasty immigrants and what they were doing to our great country. There have always been gullible Americans ready to listen to sermons that point out scapegoats for their problems, and these scapegoats often have been immigrants. In the 1920s, a series of laws were passed in the United States that slammed the door on immigrants. The quota system was put in place by these laws and allowed that migrants from any country could not exceed 3% of the population from that country already in the United States. In practice, this pretty much shut down most migration, because the countries like Germany or England that could have qualified for lots of immigrants into the U.S. didn't actually have many takers any longer. And the countries where lots of people still wanted to come to America didn't have the existing populations that would make that 3% amount to anything substantial. So immigration dried up to a trickle. Then the stock market crashed, the Great Depression stalked the land, and eventually gave way to World War II when nobody much was traveling across the oceans as international migrants, so the whole issue was put on a back burner for a couple of decades. Then, however, the war ended, the clouds parted, and the long post-war economic boom started up in the United States, just as it did in many other countries in the late 1940s. Prosperity settled over the country like a warm blanket. The suburbs began to bloom all around our great cities. The economy began to generate new jobs at an incredible rate, and things were looking really good. In the normal course of events, as they had been half a century earlier, this should have generated another huge wave of immigrants anxious to come and share in these new good times. But of course, the doors were still shut. The Statue of Liberty still had that sign around her neck saying, "Keep your huddled masses, we've got enough." So there was no immigration response to the economic upswing this time. After he thought about it for a while, the consequences of this became clear to Easterlin. The United States faced a classic divergence of supply and demand, in this case with respect to labor as a factor of production. The demand for labor grew at a breathtaking rate as the economy expanded. But the supply of labor was represented by the unusually small generation of people born during the Great Depression, the result of a low birth rate that actually continued right up to the end of World War II. I call this generation that came of age right after the war the lucky few. They were few both because the birth rate had been low for a quarter of a century and because hardly any migrants had been coming into the country during that time. They were lucky because they were in the right place at the right time. The right place was a country that didn't allow any immigrants, and the right time was at the start of a long period of rapid economic growth. The result is easy to predict from basic economics. The same result always appears when a market is faced with rising demand and falling supply. Prices, in this case the price of labor, rose steeply. Everybody got jobs right out of high school if they wanted them. People with jobs started getting rapid promotions as new corporations sprang up everywhere and began expanding their operations. Even the most skeptical young couple would have admitted in those days that it looked like they couldn't lose. The future was bright with virtually no doubts or fears on the horizon. Easterlin and his colleagues find it is only a short step from this rosy picture of prosperity to what this small generation of Americans did next. They started getting married at an unprecedented rate. The average age at marriage in 1958 dropped down to 19.2, the youngest average age ever observed in the history of the country. Nearly everybody got married as soon as they could, and then nearly all of those new couples started having babies. They didn't really have more children than earlier couples. In fact, the average family size of mothers was just a shade lower during the baby boom than it had been before. But the fact that virtually everybody got married and did so at such young ages produced a flood of babies between 1946 and 1964 that has gone down in history as the baby boom. At the time, it was also referred to as motherhood mania. And this is one side of the coin of Easterlin's basic thesis. When young adults in the family-forming ages, that is between ages 15 and 30 or so, are in short supply in the economy, things tend to go so well for them that they get very confident and optimistic and are more likely to get married and have some babies. The short supply part of this is what Easterlin means by the phrase relative cohort size, and the babies are what demographers refer to as fertility outcomes. But Easterlin's coin has two sides. Just as small relative cohort size predicts good times ahead, encouraging early marriage and more births, large relative cohort size predicts worse times ahead, leading to postponed marriages and fewer births. To see this other side of the coin, all we have to do is fast forward a generation ahead to when all those babies in the baby boom got out of school and started looking for their own jobs. They were leaving behind schools that had never been so crowded with students in huge classrooms, only to face intense new competition in a labor market that did not have enough jobs for all of them. This meant that twice as big a share, over 10% rather than less than 5% of the previous small generation, of young men could not find employment in the years when they normally would have been marrying and starting families. People who did get jobs found slow rates of promotion. Raises were scarce because employers knew that they didn't have to worry about people quitting. As a result, of course, the baby boomers delayed their marriages much longer, and the share of people who never married at all also increased. Among those who did get married, there were further delays in having babies, and more couples remained completely childless. Just as a small generation had encountered good times and produced a bumper crop of babies, this large generation encountered bad times and produced Generation X, a generation that again had fewer people in it than the generation of their parents. This, then, is the Easterland Cycle. Small generations encounter great working conditions, so they optimistically marry and have children. Large generations find themselves competing for jobs in short supply, so they postpone marriage and parenthood. Potentially, these large and small generations, once they get started on a cyclic pattern like this, could go on alternating indefinitely into the future. This is the final question that Easterlin and his colleagues turn to in their article. Once they get started, do Easterland cycles of this sort indeed repeat themselves over and over? Do small and large cohorts alternate with each other for several generations? And we might add a second question for future thought as well. Was this pattern something peculiar only to American society in the post-war era? Or is it some kind of general principle that we might observe in action at other times in other places? Taking on the role of fortune teller, complete with crystal ball, we turn next to these questions. When scholars in the social sciences say that their statistical models predict some kind of outcome, they're not actually talking about the future. They usually mean that they have detected some kind of link between what they see as causes and outcomes in data already collected from social settings in the past. But Easterlin's article shows us that rare bird an actual prediction about the future. His measure of relative cohort size, which he believes should go hand in hand with birth rates, is based on the ratio of older to younger workers. For any particular year, he adds up the people between ages 30 and 64, and then divides that by the total of people between ages 15 and 29. He calls this ratio a measure of relative cohort size. In other words, it's the size of older cohorts of workers relative to the newer cohorts found at the youngest working ages. But since we only start this calculation at age 15, we already have 15 years of additional births that already exist in the population at younger ages. We know how many of them will be coming into the younger part of the labor force in the next decade and a half. If we assume that death rates will stay constant at their current values, we can project the entire population ahead 15 years and calculate what will happen to the relative cohort size ratio over those coming years. This is better than a prediction. It is a simple projection of what we already know. The predicting part comes into play because Easterlin insists that fertility should follow the trend in relative cohort size. So near the end of his article, published in 1978, he and his colleagues cranked the relative cohort size measure ahead 15 years, and on that basis predict that the birth rate should also turn around and start increasing dramatically throughout the 1980s. Unfortunately, the problem with making actual predictions about the future is that sometimes you turn out to be wrong. This was the case for the poor authors of this article. No sooner had they published the paper and started hopefully into the 1980s, when relative cohort size indeed did start rising again, just as they knew it had to do. But the total fertility rate stubbornly refused to start rising along with it, and instead continued at historically low levels that were hardly enough to replace the population for the next generation. This was pretty embarrassing for Easterlin. Other people began to criticize his original explanation, and even to suggest that maybe he was just plain wrong about the whole thing, and that the parallels he had observed were just a one-time coincidence. But before we join them and toss out the idea of Easterland cycles, we might want to think about another possibility or two. After all, Easterlin already told us that the link between birth rates and relative cohort size only became important around 1930, after the immigration faucet had been turned off by nativist laws that remained in force for nearly 40 years. Before the Great Depression, as he had learned from Kuznets while he was still a student, fluctuations in natural increase had pretty much been absent from the scene in the United States, and immigration did all the heavy lifting when it came to fluctuations in population growth rates. So Easterlin himself has already told us only to expect his cycles to appear when there is little or no chance for a whole bunch of immigrants to rush in and confuse the picture. In the late 1960s, the United States again drastically revised its immigration laws, and a new flood of immigrants began to pour into the country just as they had during the last decades of the 1800s. This time they were coming predominantly from Latin America and Asia rather than Europe, because that is where the demographic transition had moved on to by that point, and that is where the gaps could be found between birth and death rates that produced lots of people who needed a place to go. So when we look at Generation X following the baby boom and we see a small generation again, our first reflex might be to follow Easterlin's basic recipe and to expect this small generation to encounter lots of economic success, and therefore to marry early and start having babies again. The opposite of their boomer parents who have to scramble and compete with each other for the rest of their lives. But if we had millions and millions of new immigrants entering the United States, more and more each decade through the 1970s, then the 1980s, then the 1990s, and on into the new century in ever-increasing numbers, we have to stop and realize that most of these new immigrants are coming into exactly the age groups where Generation X has been living during those decades, and that the original smaller birth cohort of Generation X has grown by many millions of people as a result of that migration. This may have meant more competition for jobs, slower advancement, and of course, that would also explain why they've continued to marry later and have fewer children, just like their boomer parents. So the takeaway message from Easterlin's own description and explanation of cycles that bear his name is that before you go looking for Easterland cycles linking relative cohort size to birth rates, first you need to check that two required conditions really are present. If you don't find both of these, says Easterlin himself, you shouldn't even expect such cycles to happen. The absence of a link between relative cohort size and fertility might just mean that one or both of these conditions are missing, not that the theory itself is wrong. The first condition stresses that people must be competing for jobs in an open labor market. If a big generation creates more competition between more people, they will have to settle for less employment and less money. If a small generation enjoys less competition between fewer people, they will be able to command more money and experience higher rates of employment. This is nothing more than one of the fundamental properties of a free market. The second condition needed for Easterland cycles is that migration must be blocked somehow from responding to shortages or surpluses of labor. If a labor shortage can be resolved simply by importing several million immigrant workers, the small generation no longer has any reason to look forward to favorable labor market conditions they might have enjoyed. Both of these conditions, the free and competitive labor market and strong restrictions on immigration, were present during the middle decades of the 20th century, where Easterlin found his relative cohort size effects. Whether such effects can appear in other contexts remains a subject for future investigations.